All right. Well, this is Ramney Perez I'm the pastor of Fordham Community Church, and this is Café con Letra, where we aim to provide biblical answers for the block. And I am super excited for this episode. I'm here with my good friend, the homie, Charles, and we are about to have a conversation that we hope will be helpful to you. That would include a nuanced and yet truthful, honest perspective and understanding and diving into a lot of the details that happened and are ongoing or occurred with the Breanna Taylor case. And the reason we're having this conversation with Charles is because Charles works at the Louisville Metro Police Department. Is that the correct terminology?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And my brother's a believer, a faithful believer, a good friend. And so, man, let's just begin with a little bit about you, man. Tell us about, just briefly, who you are, family, faith, those dynamics.
Yeah. So I'm originally from Nigeria, West Africa, raised in Louisville, Kentucky. I am married to Siobhan, and we have two children, CJ and Nevaeh.
Ooh, phenomenal. Man, and that's a picture of you guys right back there painting. So
yeah, it is. Yeah.
Beautiful couple. Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Now, one thing that Charles, you got to know about Charles, he's probably one of the best dressed. His drip is always tight. Yeah. All right, man. So tell us a little bit about what you do. What's your what's your job?
And I've been with LMPD, Louisville Metro Police Department, for 3 years. I work in the 1st Division. It's in the west end of Louisville, in the predominantly Black neighborhood. So I'm a beat officer.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
So speaking of the Breonna Taylor case, I don't know what, I'm familiar with Louisville. I lived there a couple of years while I was in Masters, obviously, and that's where our relationship started. But did she live in the West End?
No, she lived off in the 3rd Division. So like Dixie Highway area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, I know exactly. Okay, so south.
Yeah.
Okay. Phenomenal. All right, man. So really where I want to begin, man, as believers, I think a lot of Christians are having an ongoing conversation, not only really about this case, but this case as a sort of picture of a microscopic, of a larger reality. This is a small sort of focused picture of a larger reality that people are feeling, experiencing, having questions about, frustrations about. We're currently probably living what is the largest civil rights movement in this country since the civil rights. And so it's been a large dynamic. And I know personally, one of the things I felt is that as a pastor, but really as Christians and as believers, we need to have biblical grounding in how we process this. And I think the church and as believers are best equipped to have these kinds of conversations in ways that are helpful, in ways that are sort of peacemaking and lead to truth and reality and justice. So first thing, man, how do you think about justice biblically, just as a believer? I know that you are, a man who's committed to the scriptures and to the word of God. So how do you think about and formulating just the concept of what God calls us to think about in light of justice?
Yeah.
Are there any scripture passages that
Yeah. I think it starts with God, right? I think looking at it through the lens of just God's character, right? Like, God is justice, right? I mean, that is who he is, just his character. It's one of his attributes. And from there, kind of just flushing it out from there. And I think it kind of helps you just put things in perspective as well. It's like just knowing that not only is God justice, but, one day there will be, or he will execute ultimate justice. And I think, we try to, just through the government and criminal justice system that we have established, we try to execute justice as best as we can, right? And the justice that we execute in reality isn't ultimate justice. If I kill someone, I get life in prison. That's still not ultimate justice. So I think also just knowing, like, yes, we call out injustice wherever and whenever we see it. But also knowing that, it doesn't, regardless of how many policies or laws we change, this world would never be a utopia,
Mm,
unless there would be no need for heaven.
mm,
But but as we call out injustice, knowing that, keeping our eyes on the reality that one day God will execute exact, perfect justice, and that should be our hope. Our hope shouldn't be in the fact of this situation didn't turn out the way we desired it to be. Um, and I think that's what we're seeing now is just this hope in particularly in these officer involved shootings and police brutality, where we're resting in the fact that, okay, this officer will be charged, which is good. I'm all for that. I'm 10 toes down on that, especially the officers who are bent on using excessive force. Let's fire them, let's charge them, let's convict them. Excuse me. But in reality, this isn't ultimate justice. So I think, just looking at it from a biblical perspective, and I think when all these things started happening, I was just challenged to look at it through the lens of the Bible. And time again, I kept coming across verses about just how God is justice, right? I think the Psalms is just littered with verses about, absolutely, about, God's righteousness and justice are the foundations of his throne and things of that nature. Psalms 89 comes to mind. Isaiah, I believe it is Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and please the widow's cause. So I think, there's this idea of, since God is a just God, that we too as believers should pursue justice whenever there needs to be, and in light of the fact that there is an ultimate justice coming.
Yeah, that's good, man. I think that's good. I think it's such a reality. We live in this in between, and to a certain extent, it really just, for the believer and really for the Christian church, adds a unique role in the in between, right? Like, we are called to be the people of light in the midst of a perverse and dark generation, because only we know what it's like to be in a relationship, a peaceful relationship with that King who is just. That we've reconciled through that very King who gave his life for us, died on the cross on our behalf to make us just and to reconcile us to himself. And now we live sort of as the representation on earth of what it's like and what it will be to live under his reign. And so there's a specific calling as Christians that we have to live out the realities of his just kingdom by being people, just like you said, who seek and correct oppression and seek justice, who declare it, who are salt and light. And it's true, man. I think too often, there's limitations to the good and reform we'll accomplish on this world, but we're still called to faithfully pursue it. It's not so much about the end result as much as about us being faithful and not neglecting to do our calling as Christians. So that's good, man. I think with that kind of framework and thinking about Christians, we are people who care to have that kind of conversation. And it seems like for a lot of people, and if I'm honest, man, I got all kinds of personal questions about whether justice was executed in this case, and really as a burden for a larger reality. So let me just set the context, and then I want us to begin to have a conversation about the Breanna Taylor case more detailed, specifically because I know that both you've thought about it, you've even put out videos thinking about it and trying to articulate. You called exactly what Kentucky's AG basically did before he did it. And so I want to have that more nuanced, detailed conversation. But I think the sort of context is important. And by that, I simply mean, this country, and really most of the Western countries, right? Like the Americas, by that I mean. So where I'm from, the Dominican Republic, are countries that experienced and are built upon a history of slavery and a history of subjugation of people of color. And as a result of that destructive, heretical idea that a person is less made in the image of God, or does not have the dignity and the worth of being made in the image of God because they are a person of color, has deep ramifications, and I think pervades and influences the systems we built, and the ways we built structures and the ways we built societies. And so it's like, for a lot of people, this case is just, another instance and expression of a reality that is already at play and pervasive. Okay. But with that context, and as people feel like that, let's have a little bit more nuanced, detailed conversation on this case. So can you just walk us through the details of the case, what occurred, as best as you can, and as clearly as you can help us?
Yeah. So there was a search warrant that was applied for Breonna Taylor's residence. So that the details of that search warrant is being investigated now by the FBI, whether or not there's accusations that there was information that was falsified or fabricated in that search warrant. So the FBI. I'm sorry?
In order to obtain the search warrant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the FBI is investigating that as we speak. So there was a search warrant applied for 3 residents. Her residence was one of the 3. And the search warrant was conducted by Sergeant Mattingly, ex-detective Brent Hakinson, and Detective Miles Cosgrove. So what we know as of now, based upon Kenneth Walker's statement and Sergeant Mattingly's statement, is that Sergeant Mattingly knocked on the door. He said that he knocked 3 to 4 times, and he said that he wanted to give Breonna Taylor some time just to come to the door. The original intent was to kind of pick her up and bring her in for questioning. Kenneth Walker corroborated that and said that they heard 3 to 4 rounds of knocking at the door, and they were laying in the bed watching a movie. So Kenneth Walker said that he thought that it could have been Breonna Taylor's ex-boyfriend because he had pulled up over there before while he was there. So that's why he said he grabbed his gun, and they were walking to the door when Sergeant Mattingly and the other detectives made entry in the door. Kenneth Walker said that he couldn't hear them announcing themselves. The officer said that they were announcing
beyond just knocking.
Beyond just knocking, yeah. But they couldn't hear Kenneth Walker and Breonna Taylor yelling, "Who is it?" So Kenneth Walker said that every time they knocked, they both yelled, "Who is it? Who is it?" So it is a possibility they just couldn't hear each other. So they made entry, and Kenneth Walker said that he shot 1 round, and that round hit Sergeant Mattingly in the leg, and Sergeant Mattingly and Miles Cosgrove returned fire in that hallway. And Brent Hakinson, who was on the outside of the apartment, started firing through the window. So in that exchange of gunfire, Breonna Taylor was struck.
Thank you, man. Awesome. Okay, so and then I know that the AGs, based on, as in their investigation, the AG basically then there was an indictment for what's the name of the gentleman?
Brent Hakinson.
Okay, who fired through the sliding glass doors because he had no line of sight, and there was blinds. And so in the act of shooting in there, wantonly endangering or showing a wanton, what was the language? Basically, lack of regard for human life.
Yeah.
Right. And so he gets indicted. And the other 2 are not indicted or don't face any charges because there is a estimation that it was justified firing back because Kenneth Walker, Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, fired first, and so it's a justified defense in that instance. Correct? So, man, so there's let's just dive a little bit into some of the nuances, and I know this is a little bit different of the Café con Letras that we normally do, but I think there's a couple. I think so much of it comes down to what actually occurred in that exchange. Because I know that the warrant was issued initially as a no-knock warrant, but it wasn't, according to them, it wasn't then served as a no-knock warrant. You're saying that they announced. But it's interesting because in the there's a 911 call that I even heard by Mr. Walker after, and he's clearly in that call, he's like, I'm not sure. He's calling 911. He's calling the cops. He doesn't think the cops are at his door. And he's like, I'm not sure what's happening. Someone just shot my girlfriend. So part of the concerns I have and the questions I have really as a believer who cares for justice is, how did we even get there, right? Like, how did that happen? Because so let me just lay out and then just tell me what you think. So he's concerned that he's responding to someone who's not a cop, right? Now they say they announced it, so I imagine they're believing somebody's firing at them as we're servicing this warrant. And then what was relied upon to make that estimation was the testimony of a witness. And the testimony of that witness, initially he stated to police in a recorded call that no, they did not announce themselves. And then 2 months later, I believe, they keep sort of reaching out, and he says, oh, okay, yeah, maybe I'm misrecollecting it. So there's a relying on this witness whose testimony seems to be like, am I getting that right, by the way? Is that somewhat?
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and so if there's something I'm not getting right, you let me know.
Okay, no, you're fine.
Okay. So I guess my question is, what is the normal process for servicing a warrant of that nature?
Yeah. So I guess it depends. So like I've never served a no-knock warrant.
Okay.
So the warrants that I've been a part of, we've always knocked and announced. Okay. Just so situations like this don't happen. And I mean, in reality, you don't want to be that guy who's the first one through the door if you didn't knock or announce. You know what I'm saying? Just because there's just such a high possibility of you getting dumped on. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, right. So so yeah, we've knocked and announced on all the warrants that I've been a part of. And it's more of an officer safety issue than it is anything, So it's like that. I mean, yes, you want that element of surprise, but we also want to go home at the end of the day. For sure. So yeah. So as far as them knocking it, as far as them announcing, both Kenneth Walker and Sergeant Manley said that they knocked. But as far as them announcing themselves as police and relying on that one witness, I have questions about that as well. Was he the only person who was up at night? And the other, I think it was 11 people that they interviewed were sleeping. So is that the reason why they didn't hear it, or was everybody up and he's the only one who heard it? So yeah, I have questions about that as well. Because if he's the only one. I'm sorry.
At what time was the warrant served?
It was served late at night. I'm not exactly sure what exactly time, but it was at nighttime. Yeah. Nighttime into the early morning.
Oh, so real late at night, like we talking about?
Yeah, so it was like nighttime into the morning. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because that's a question I have myself, because so there's this dynamic of you're relying on this guy's testimony, and I do think in his statement the AG said he implied, or he made clear that it was testimony of one witness, right? Because every other witness has said they did not hear it. And yet that testimony is disputed, right? So that's to if I'm honest, like to some extent, as a man of color who has experienced what I think is racially profiling on my end, there's this difficulty there, right? Which I think a lot of people feel when they view that. Like there's already, like how you see, like there's this trust there. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's this trust because it seems like, are we trying to make sure we do everything we can to protect, our police officers? Now, I want to say something. I pastor brothers who are police officers. You're a good friend of mine who is a police officer.
Yeah.
So my desire and my intent is not to unnecessarily disparage, but rather to say, I explain it this way. Bad heretical pastors make my job harder.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why do they make my job harder? Because in our day, we continually have people falling, pastors abusing authority. You hear of a scandal from a well-respected, well-known pastor, having affairs in the background, money siphoning, all these, people teaching and trying to just get money. And so people have a great distrust for anyone in any position of authority and anyone whose job is to, pastor and teach. And it makes my job harder. It really does. But that doesn't mean I want those pastors out free doing, and people listening to them. I'm glad that they're no longer doing, and that you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
I have to own into that, which is why, what you said in the beginning is so helpful and so encouraging. You know what I'm saying? Like, what we need is that kind of stance, specifically from Christian men who are serving in that industry. You know what I mean? Who are cops. So my intent is not that, right? But at the same time, I think as believers, we are pitted in our culture. If we are truly believers, then often the line is like, oh, those people are, criminals, and so it's okay for that to happen to them. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And yet there's such a mistrust because of the experience that people have. And when you look at some of the details of this case, that just adds to it. You get what I'm saying? In my mind. Yeah. So I don't know. How should we think through that, man? What are your thoughts on that? Can we just chop it together on that?
Yeah. But yeah, I feel you on that. It resonates. I resonate with you with that. As far as like, yeah, I mean, it's cliche. I mean, I'm sure you heard it, but like, no one dislikes a bad cop more than a good cop, right? It's yeah, it's frustrating when something happens in California or in Texas, and you feel, the residual effects of it here, in Louisville, or something happens here, you know what I'm saying? So, yeah, I think just wanting just the desire for truth and and for justice. So, whatever that means. So let's arrive at the truth, and then from there, let's figure out how we deal with this situation. And if I acted unlawfully in an incident, whether it be out of fear or complete negligence, then I need to be dealt with, accordingly. And so yeah, and also for the sake of other officers as well. I think officers across the world have been put in more danger because of these incidents, and just the amount of threats and even officers getting killed. We had 2 officers get shot here in Louisville a couple weeks ago. So I think it's important that we deal with these situations and we rid ourselves of those officers, and just so they're not contaminating the whole bunch, and just so that they're not representing a whole department.
Good. So a couple other questions I have regarding the details, and then let's have a larger conversation, which we're already beginning to have. But in the incident report written maybe by Mattingly, if I remember correct, I'm not sure. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but he says that there was no forced entry, and that there was no injuries to Breonna Taylor. I don't even know where to even start with that one. How did
so there's and I think them putting that out without really explaining what this report is, just did it such a disservice to people. Yeah, it wasn't helpful at all. So like whenever you have any kind of report, there's a public narrative and then there's a investigative narrative. And the public narrative is extremely vague. If there are any details even given in the public narrative. And the investigative narrative is where, you list all the details. I'm not sure why they checked the box for no injuries. That's a question I have as well, especially, even though it's a public narrative and you want to be extremely vague because that's open to public record. That's just false, right? Or maybe the other alternative was a fatality, so maybe the injury box or drop down box was if someone was still alive but had injuries. And then there was another option where it was just fatality.
But that wasn't checked, right? There wasn't a.
But I didn't see that. I didn't see that. So so that's why it came out blank. Because it was the public narrative. So I feel like they should have came out and said, hey, the report we're releasing isn't the investigative report because the investigation's still going on. So we can't release that yet. But we're releasing the report that states, okay, her address was on this warrant, her name was on this warrant, and here are the results of what occurred. And so that's why it was blank.
So that report is filled out by the officer on scene or later when he's like sort of doing paperwork, and it's meant to be a general summary of what.
I'm not sure when it comes to officer involved shootings who fills out the report. I'm not sure if it's the PIU unit, the public integrity unit, or if it's the sergeant or the commanding officer of the officer who was involved. I'm not sure.
Okay. I'm just trying to.
But I know, like,
I didn't realize there were two. I didn't realize.
I know, like, in just like a general report. If I was to take a report for you, there would be a public narrative and then an investigative narrative.
And you would normally fill that out if it was not.
Yeah, I would normally fill that out. Yeah, for just a general report. Yeah.
Okay, and then the general report is meant to be more of a general summary, vague, and the other one's more detailed. Am I understanding that correctly?
The public narrative. The public narrative is vague. And
now when you say vague, I'm thinking general summary, but like not detailed. But vague could also mean intentionally misleading. Like what you know what I'm saying? So what does that mean? Like,
yeah, right. I got you. Yeah. So vague would be just void of detail. Okay. Right. So let's say I was to take a report for you. Somebody stole your wallet. Right. So the report would read, listed subject had his wallet stolen at listed location. So I wouldn't put your name in there. I wouldn't put the location in there. I would just list the elements of the crime. And then in the investigative narrative, that's when I would go into detail. He was at this place, he had this much in his wallet. This happened and stuff like that.
I understand. Okay. Yeah. So we can't presume as to why or how that came about. But again, that's another specific dynamic where it's like, why is that public narrative report so off? Because even if it's just like, at least it's vague, it's not giving details, but it's they did have a forced entry, right? I mean, they rammed through the door, says no forced entry, and not only is there injuries, there's actual fatality, right? Like there's a person who's dead. And on top of that, she wasn't rendered aid. And I know the AG emphasized this. She wasn't rendered aid for, I believe, 20 minutes. But the AG emphasized, she would have died right away. So there are details there that add to that compound. You know what I mean? Yeah. So difficult.
I think and I have those questions as well. As far as like the blank incident.
Because that's really. All right, well, go ahead, bro. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good, man. Yeah, I mean, it's questions I have as well, because I mean, as much as, the public wants to know the details and wants to, find out the truth of what happened, we want to as well.
For sure.
You know what I'm saying? So, but as far as the not rendering aid, so whenever there's an officer involved shooting, especially like this one, they made entry, they were fired upon, and they fired back and backed out. So then, typically you wait for SWAT to come, and SWAT either calls the subject out or they clear the house themselves. So in this instance, they called him out. So you don't know if that threat is neutralized yet. So even though, you may have shot off many rounds, but you don't want to go back in there because, that person may be hiding and may try to ambush you or something. You know what I'm saying? So when they backed out, at the time, they didn't know, who was dead or even who was shot, right? But they were just waiting for SWAT, who was more trained to deal with situations like that, and then they called them out. And so that's just a safer situation for the officer.
That makes sense. Okay. One final sort of logistical questions, and then we can have a little bit more of a forward-thinking, broader conversation, and maybe just try to help assess for folks who are listening in conversation. So there was no body camera on, and can you help? How come? Why was there no body?
So the narcotics officers were never issued no body cams because they work as undercover officers. So they were never issued them. So they never had body cameras.
Okay. So okay, interesting. So those guys normally works as undercops, meaning that they're normally in plain clothes.
Plain clothes, yeah.
Okay. But in this instance, they were in the clothing identified as police, or do we not?
Yeah, they had police vest on, and So there was officers who arrived after the fact who had body cameras on.
Yeah.
But the three who made entry didn't have body cameras. They weren't issued body cameras.
Yeah. They were never, because of their specific job role.
Yeah, because they're in narcotics. Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay. All right, man. So I think what I can say about this, obviously we're not going to change what occurred, but I hear a lot about, especially from folks who are like, whose heart is to say, oh, but let's listen to the truth. I kind of want to say, yes, Christians ought to care for the truth. But it's kind of interesting when you look at the details and the truth, and it raises legitimate questions in this case.
Absolutely.
As it does in almost often a lot of cases, right? Like it raises legitimate questions, and serves to underscore the possible ongoing, I think the real ongoing issue of the relationships that we have in our communities with policing, the relationships we have in our community with injustice and oppression in general. And I say communities, I mean communities of color. Like I pastor in a context where 90% is Latino, Black, white, African, like just all people of color. And so you feel that, you get what I'm saying, in a real sense on the ground, and people have that. So for example, man, I think one of the most healing, or probably the most healing interaction I've ever had with a cop up until that point was one time. I don't know if you remember this, bro, but you were stationed, you were working what's the firework?
Thunder over Louisville.
Thunder over Louisville.
Yeah.
And right there near church. And I was, we had parked, my wife and I, and we was coming through, walking on foot down to the waterfront. If you're not familiar with Louisville, they do this big fireworks show near the waterfront, near downtown. And you was in a full, cop gear. You was in you was working, right? And I came up and we gave that, right? And it was the first time I've ever given that to a cop in full clothing. I never had that kind of interaction with a cop ever. And to me, it was, I told my wife after, I was like, that probably was the most healing interaction I've ever had with a cop ever. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you're my boy, you're my friend besides that, but it was like because it's always felt like they're not necessarily on my side. You get what I'm saying? I'm the one on the other side that's a suspect almost always. That's how it feels for a lot of us. And so it was very, very interesting and very healing. So really, what are some ways, how should we think about, really as Christians, with this concern for justice, trying to see that played out or influence in reform in any way? Should there be reform? Should there be a blowing up? What should we do? What are ways to think about it going forward?
Yeah, I think there should be reform. I think just particularly with our department, and we're actually having discussions now, and even have submitted proposals about how we can change training dynamics and recruitment and selection and like I've mentioned before, we have a week in the police academy that's Spanish week. So we learn about Hispanic culture. We learn about, how to engage Hispanics and what's offensive and what's not to say and what to say. And I think we also need a Black Culture Week. I think that would be helpful. I think us not learning about the history of policing and the progression of policing in America is another issue. I think in every other career you go into, you learn about just the progression of that career, whether that be education, whether that be nursing, or you learn about the history of it, so we don't talk about slave patrols, we don't talk about, the Jim Crow enforcement. We don't talk about what policing looked like during the civil rights era movement. So which is all kind of connected to how it's the lens by which people are viewing the police now. So these one-off isolated situations are being connected to what has happened, for the past 100 years, you know what I'm saying? So, and people aren't disconnecting the two. So I've heard several people make that argument, the amount of unarmed Black men that are being killed by police are decreasing every year, and praise God for that. But when these incidents happen, it's kind of just like a reminder of the police brutality that African Americans and minorities have experienced for hundreds of years. So I think that would be good, right? Learning about, so when you do get out of the academy, even for white and Black officers, right, you know what lens the public is seeing you through, and that way you can just have more wisdom to navigate. And when you walk up to them, you know what they're thinking. So I think that would be beneficial. And so yeah, even just the way like promotions look and recruitment and selection. So yeah, we're thinking about those things, and so I think those things would be great. Those things would be absolutely, it would be beneficial for all officers to have that. And even our in-service, our training yearly, having someone come in and talk about that, talk about these dynamics and how we can adjust our policing and our tactics to be mindful of that.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
That's super helpful, man. What man, so this is just a curiosity as a pastor who my desire is to see and care for and see the gospel expand and see gospel healthy churches planted. And I want our church to be the kind of church that if you took us out of here and out of our neighborhood, out of our city, the neighborhood would feel it, including because we helped create such a much healthier dynamic and relationship. So this is my question, man. Like you as a believer, but also as a cop, and I think as a man who thinks about these things well, you know what I mean? Like you have you've thought about it, right? How could a pastor, how could a believer, what ways could they approach precincts or cops in their neighborhoods to foster healthier relationships? You know what I mean? Like what could be done on our end? Any thoughts on that? I'm just throwing it at you, but yeah.
Man, I don't think it has to be super unique or complex. I think that like a barbecue or even creating a place to have dialogue. What you're doing now is extremely helpful. So yeah.
It's good. Awesome, man. Well, that's good, man. I've appreciated our time together, brother. I'm glad to chop it up on these things. It's I think like there's a lot of us are getting all kinds of information from all kinds of different spheres, and sometimes
Mm,
accurate, sometimes not accurate. Um, and we feel, even as I look at this case, if I'm honest, I feel to a certain extent like, man, what could I do about it? You get what I'm saying? You feel to a certain extent powerless in the ability to actually do something. And I think starting where we are, living justly, and I think that's produced by the gospel in a believer's heart, faithfully where you are is so important.
yeah.
Uh, Making sure if you work at a place, you're just with those people who work under you. You know what I'm saying? Making sure that you are, seeking the care for the widow and the orphan around you. I think sometimes we get so caught up in trying to do a social media type stuff where it's like, let me bring justice to Minnesota, but what are you doing where you are? You know what I'm saying? How are you being a believer in your context where the Lord has placed you? And I think one of the good examples that you present to us, brothers, is like, how do you try to do that in the honestly complex and nuanced and hard place that I imagine it could be as a believer who's a cop who's also black? Like, how do you know what I'm saying? Like, I imagine at times you may maybe feel like you're being pulled in every which way, but I think being grounded in Christ and in His role, and yet to say like, okay, this is my job. I want to do this well to the glory of God. This could be a good thing to my community. I can see the issues at play, the justice issues that have ongoing, and yet I want to a certain extent, pursue it through my job, right? Through me doing it effectively. Um, so I think that at one level, I wanted to have this conversation because it helps us to have, let's talk about the facts, the nuance, you know what I'm saying?
Mm,
But also as believers, just to encourage us that as we have these conversations, there's not always an easy, one-sided answer, right? Like we have to
yeah.
navigate to all of that.
Yeah.
Um, any final things you'd like to say, man, or things that you would encourage folks that might be tuning into to like think about, to equip themselves to think about?
Mm,
Uh, yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I think here lately, I think I've just been having a lot of conversations about like the final announcement,
yeah.
and what Daniel Cameron presented to the grand jury and what the grand jury decided on, and which is
But
you said what?
I have questions about that.
Go ahead. We can chop it up about it.
No, finish what you was gonna say because I cut you
Okay,
off.
okay.
Yeah,
Now, so yeah, man, it's I mean, in a sense, you kind of feel torn as well. You like, man, like, a life was lost,
yeah,
right? So how do we deal with this? How does this lost life? Who does this lost life fall on?
mm,
And I think just because the situation is so complex and unique, that yeah, it takes a lot of time just to kind of think through and reason through,
yeah,
which I think Lord has kind of just given me the opportunity to talk to a lot of people about. So yeah, so when it essentially, from the way I understand it, let me say,
okay,
um, I believe there are six homicide laws in Kentucky. And, a lot of people are asking, like, a person's life was lost, right? Like, who's going to pay for this person's life?
yeah,
And, and you heard murder being thrown out a lot, like they need to be charged with murder.
mhm,
And so I think the difficult thing about the way the law was written is that in order for there to be a murder charge, let's just throw out murder, right? You would have to, well, first you need probable cause to just charge an officer.
mm,
But in order to get a conviction, you need beyond a reasonable doubt. So you would have to convince a jury that their intent was to kill Miss Taylor when they were knocking on that door beyond a reasonable doubt.
prior to the interaction.
Prior to the interaction, yeah. They had intents on going there and killing her. So it wouldn't fit the murder charge. And quite frankly, it wouldn't have fit any of the homicide laws that we have. Just because there's an intent element and there's like a negligence element
Mm,
that it just didn't meet. And I think because it's because of the dynamics of what occurred, you know, it's so unique in nature, but there's not a law that addresses what happened.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a wrongful death lawsuit, you know, and that's where
Civil case.
the civil case, the 12 million came in from. But there's no wrongful death law, you know. So like, you know, I think a conversation could be had, like, you know, do we want a wrongful death law? And what does that look like? And there would have to be a lot of caveats to that law. So yeah, so I think those are good angles to look at it at. And a lot of people are throwing out like manslaughter and involuntary manslaughter, and which again, you would have to prove, you know, negligence of some sort or intent of some sort, and considering just the proximity of Miss Taylor and Kenneth Walker. And you know, Kenneth Walker said in his statement that when he shot and he started hearing gunshots, he fell into a room that he was beside. He said he was right beside a door frame. And so he shot, fell into a room, and those rounds that were coming back down that hallway hit Breonna Taylor. So I think just proximity wise, it would be difficult to charge those officers with the laws that we have, you know. So I think, yeah, a conversation could be had, like, you know, do we want to change the laws? Do we want to add another law that will capture or fit an incident like this? So yeah, it's just complex, and I'm still thinking through it. And but yeah, it's hard. You know, it's hard to you know, imagine that being my sister or my daughter, you know, and no one's being charged for what occurred.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, I feel that. I think that's actually really helpful because to me, I was telling my wife, I was telling Daji this, like, I think that the biggest difficulty and hardship that feels unjust, that feels wrong about this is, how did these two parties end up there? You get what I'm saying? I mean, I understand why the Warrant, to a certain extent, you know, her boyfriend, her ex-boyfriend sometimes visited this in the past, and he's a, you know, drug, but he had already been captured and arrested by the time this warrant is being serviced. I don't know what the situation looks like. You know, Kenneth Walker has a legal license to defend himself, right? Carrying a gun. He did nothing wrong. He didn't fire 17 shots. He fired one shot at a leg to say, like, yo, like, why are you coming into my house? I'm trying to protect my home. You should be able to do that, right, in this country, per laws that we have in place. And yet, because of the unique dynamics of it being cops coming in and them, you know what I mean, like, just the whole misunderstanding just feels wrong, right? She's in her home. She has a right to be there. They have a warrant, so I guess they have a right to be there. But you get what I'm saying? Like, it just all feels wrong in every which way. And it does, by you putting it, like, on who does this life fall? It does. I think that's the right way to put it, right? Everybody wants it to fall on somebody, and to a certain extent, it's like, man, like, you know.
And that's why it's, yeah. I mean, there were talks of Kenneth Walker being charged with her death. And
compound the difficulty to me if that were to happen.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I think just kind of personally, you know, I believe him. You know, I don't think he knew 100% that it was the police on the other side of the door. For several. Number one, there's still that stigma of, you know, if you shoot a police, you know, you're gonna get 25 to life, or people think they're gonna get 25 to life. Secondly, you know, if you shoot at the police, you know, you actually want to kill one. You get what I'm saying? You know, you're not trying to you're not gonna shoot one round. And thirdly, I mean, it's people know it's suicide. You know, in the sense of, you know, I'm most likely gonna die if I shoot at the police. You know, so that's why most of the people who shoot at the police end up killing themselves. So yeah, for those.
Well, and I think the 911 call right after, where he called the cops 911, and he's saying, "I don't know what's happening." You know, Breanna. Clearly, I think adds to everything you're saying. That he did not believe these were cops coming in.
I don't think he knew it at that moment he was 100% sure that that they were the police.
Yeah. Which brings to light the difficulties of was there ever an announcement, or what the announcement
Yeah.
and just the difficulty of was this executed in such a way that, provided justice. But I do think, man, we've had a good conversation. I do think that bigger question of what do our laws, like writing the laws, right? How do they capture these kinds of things?
Mm-hmm.
I think that already begins to point you to the complexity of, and really to the difficulty of the issue that we're facing in this society, because it's an issue that is sort of woven in through so many. It's like a yarn ball, right? Like it's almost every aspect of
and
it's all tied to, and it's hard to disentangle that, right? Because how the laws are written, and then how they're enforced, and whether they're enforced with partiality, where the laws are written in such a way that they are, like they're not impartial.
Yeah.
There's all these kinds of difficulties that are at play. And I think as believers, we're not all experts in all those fields. I want more believers in your field. I think my final question here in a little bit is when you're running for police chief. But let me leave that. but I'm trying to get you in trouble with no uprise. But I think, like, as believers, we are called, and how do we salt our neighborhoods and our cities to such an extent that we can't create utopia on earth, neither should we expect it. We want heaven. We want a city that has been built by God's own hands. But as we're faithful here, how do we try to influence the culture around us and the laws that are written around us in such a way that they reflect our conviction in the image of God, that every life has meaning and value and worth, and that we want justice and impartiality full throttle, right? Like through the of it. We can't answer all those questions today, but I think this is a good conversation to start it up, man. Dude, I appreciate you, man. I appreciate you.
Thank you for having me, brother.